Hello, my name is Marija.
And I'm Arvin, and this is an Oxford University Press video about why you should teach knowledge in politics, one of the new themes in the 2020 TOK specification.
We are 5 months away from first teaching of the new spec, and also in the midst of the COVID-19 global emergency, which is why we're recording this for you from our home. Perhaps there is no time more urgent or appropriate to be talking about knowledge in politics. In one of our previous videos, we already discussed why you should try to make your whole TOK course speak to the personal and the political in 2020.
In this video today, we'll outline 4 reasons why knowledge in politics is such an important and rewarding theme for your students. We'll also offer practical suggestions on how you can take this theme beyond cliches while maintaining a focus on knowledge. And hopefully, we'll give you the confidence that you can do it well. Many of the examples we refer to in this video are developed in the sample chapter that is available for free online. The slides are also available from the link in the description, so don't worry about catching every word while you watch.
This theme readily brings to mind the media frenzies surrounding elections, referendums, and policy debates. But the intersection between politics and knowledge is much wider. It is more generally an expression of how power affects that which is contestable. And so this theme is an invitation to make power dynamics in knowledge as well as their implications visible.
What we know about the world, how we know it, and who can make claims about it are entangled with questions about who has the power to make and maintain order in the world. It is in this wider sense that we refer to politics and political life. Across disciplines and contexts, politics affects how knowledge is produced, disseminated, applied, and accessed at every level. Beyond just being an optional theme, knowledge in politics has the potential to deepen the way we teach TOK and how students engage with knowledge across the DP and beyond.
So let's get straight into it. The first reason to teach knowledge in politics is that it's in the air, it's on the internet, and it's on our students' minds. They're coming of age in a political world that intersects with identity, privilege, and technology in powerful ways. Polarization and populism appear to be on the rise, even though or perhaps because the internet is more diverse than ever before. Post-truth was literally the 2016 word of the year, but fake news has been reduced to a meme, and both are used callously and deliberately in many contexts. We now have elections that are contested over WhatsApp, and an online landscape of forums, filter bubbles, echo chambers, and political micro-targeting that our students are going to need to learn how to navigate effectively in order to be engaged citizens. Their political views and affinities are shaped by trends and phenomena that appear bewildering from across the generational gap. Case in point, OK Boomer is everywhere from TikTok all the way to the New Zealand Parliament. A critical engagement with the forces that influence our students as knowers can make sure that they're discerning and that they can tell the difference between truly profound and transformational forms of resistance and righteous discontent and deeply worrisome, illiberal, divisive influences. We take it from them when they warn us that these two can look confusingly similar.
Our students' everyday interactions, both on and offline, are also overtly political in a wider sense. How do they show up in conversations about identity and privilege? How will they participate in call-out culture or cancel culture, or respond when the same outrage targets them? In teaching the politics of knowledge, we prepare students not only for everyday politics, we also nurture their political and moral imaginations. In the long run, we will rely on their moral courage to build just and livable futures. Now, as a teacher, you may be worried about opening a can of worms or not being able to keep the focus on knowledge. These are widely raised concerns, and that's why we're making this video. Here are some suggestions to help.
The first one is to center how our students experience politics. This is not only good practice, it also frees you from having to be the expert on a range of issues that include alt-right memes of Pepe the Frog and blackfishing Instagram influencers. When it comes to topics such as allyship, virtue signaling, fragility, moves to innocence, our students can bring examples and experiences to the class. Invite them to share the latest debates and predicaments, and you will be rewarded with stimulus material that is both interesting as well as relevant to the class. Help them uncover how issues of justice, equity, and identity intersect with knowledge in their lives. Some may be told that they're too angry to be listened to, on campuses that are supposed to be freer than the rest of society by people who are more worried about respectability politics than the issues that make people shout out their dissent. They will likely be held accountable for their politics and perspectives, whether or not they think they're being political. Ask them, how do you know and make sense of whatever it is you're considering? Or what confuses you about it?
To keep a sustained focus on knowledge, foreground the processes of knowledge, its production, dissemination, application, and acquisition that underlie your case studies. You should also ground the discussion in key TOK concepts such as evidence, values, power, culture, objectivity, truth, and perspectives, and keep circling back to them as you move through the different examples. Choose case studies that are big enough to allow for comparing different perspectives and contexts. For example, you might want to look at the idea of post-truth societies, or the supposed death of expertise, or knowledge issues at the intersection of politics and technology. The danger with big topics is if they become overly conceptual or abstract. That's why they have to be grounded in specific contexts that afford comparisons as much as possible.
The second reason to teach knowledge and politics is the more fundamental relationship between the two. This is the argument that this theme is not just topical, it's perennial. As teachers, we have many different entry points into exploring this relationship. We offer 4 suggestions next for how you can tease out these dynamics.
Number 1 on our list would be the politics of science and history, tracing the argument from Francis Bacon's gendered and imperialist views through to Linda Toohey Weiss Smith's decolonial critique of research methodologies. You can do the same thing across all the different academic disciplines, from literature to medicine to law. The decolonizing discourse talks back to all of them, revealing how power has historically shaped these disciplines by centering some perspectives and systematically devaluing others. Within this, you can get into contemporary issues of diversity, inclusion, or access. For example, the first black woman professor of history ever in the UK, Olivette Otelli, was appointed only in 2018. What does that mean for knowledge in history and for the academic community and for multiculturalism in the UK? The links to knowledge and politics are clear and urgent.
Another example is the cultural ownership of artistic and historical knowledge and artifacts. This is where questions of patrimony, repatriation, appropriation, and appreciation come in. Explore why so much art and so many cultural artifacts from indigenous societies, conflict zones, and formerly colonized nations are housed in large museums in just a handful of wealthy countries. The implications of this are fascinating, and the tangents are also fascinating. For example, political legal systems have not been able to keep up with the question of cultural collective property rights. Another tangent is the invaluable artworks stored in private collection aboard billionaires' yachts. A third tangent is the argument that cultures are best studied through their collective similarities and differences, which is the justification for large universal collections at the big museums. From here, you can launch into an analysis of ownership, stewardship, and access in knowledge, and how they intersect with power. Hopefully, this is giving you a sense of the complexity and richness of this area of knowledge in politics. There are many different ways to get into this topic, and the best might be the one that is closest to your context.
We also really like exploring knowledge and politics in unlikely places. For example, the politics of objects. Here you can draw on Langdon Winner's classic paper from 1980 about overpasses constructed on Long Island, New York. The overpasses were high enough to allow cars to go under them, but not public buses, which restricted access to certain areas of the city for racial minorities and low-income groups. Winner's argument was that technology is not a neutral tool, and it has inherent politics. These overpasses continue to shape the city today, just like curb cuts on sidewalks and park benches with dividers. They exemplify a technology that distributes power a certain way, allowing certain things to happen and not others, facilitating certain actions and not others. From here, you could get into the material arrangements and technologies that accompany and reinforce gentrification, for example, if that's relevant in your home context.
A fourth and really good example is a debate from 350 years ago between Thomas Hobbes and Robert Boyle that still echoes today. The debate was concerned with what counts as knowledge and where, how, and by whom the boundaries of legitimate knowledge are drawn. This is a good place to begin deconstructing the claim that matters of fact are disinterested, neutral, independent, value-free, or in other words, beyond politics. Felix Stalder, in a 2019 paper, describes how this debate quote, not only led to the creation of different scientific disciplines, but more importantly, separated science from politics and both of them from religion. The final consequence of this would be that power, faith, and knowledge would be separated, each with its own institutions, rules, and procedures, unquote. For us in TOK, the questions are still relevant. Was this separation achieved? If so, was it universally achieved? And is it even desirable or sustainable?
So that was just 4 examples to get this engine going. In all of our case studies, we should be trying to make power relations visible. Exploring the role of power can help us to understand the processes in which knowledge is politicized or depoliticized, both of which deserve our attention in TOK. The point here is not to tell your students which things are political and which are apolitical and which are made to appear so when they are not. The point is that all of this is contestable, which makes for good TOK and helps us get beyond the tired dichotomy of neutral versus biased knowledge.
And that great enemy of every TOK teacher, the neutral to some extent. With that, a third reason for teaching knowledge and politics is to make power relations as well as their implications visible. Before we had a theme called Knowledge and Politics, students regularly made presentations about bias, neutrality, and current affairs. We saw misconduct by researchers, economic issues and scientific publishing, the meddling of business and policy, or of politics and history, and so on. The issue with many of these presentations was that even though the examples were relevant and interesting, the students often didn't manage to get to a rigorous TOK analysis. This theme is partly a response to that problem and is meant to give students more tools to analyze political phenomena through the lens of knowledge. It also gives us teachers a chance to role model for our students how to do this effectively.
That knowledge can be politicized and co-opted to serve vested interests is intuitive to our students. What's comparably underexplored and less intuitive are the processes by which knowledge is depoliticized, when it is presented and believed to be value neutral. When the people, politics, and history of how knowledge is produced disappear from view, it may seem that we are left with a view from nowhere, a black box of facts that is impenetrable, inscrutable, and taken for granted for so long that we forget to question why it is true.
Let us look at how this played out in a widely known recent example about Olympic athlete Caster Semenya. The case brought to light the combustible mix of endocrinology and gender and racial politics in sports science. The black box in this case was the normal range of testosterone in women, something that was popularly assumed to be an apolitical matter of biological fact. But what we know of normal testosterone ranges has been defined using some methodology and exported to different contexts where it overlaps problematically with categories such as sex, gender, and race. How this normal range was defined, by whom, using what data, and for what purpose has faded from memory and concern, but was thrust into prominence during this case.
As this example shows us, matters of fact and matters of concern are interwoven and often difficult to separate. They are also useful entry points for us to explore the tension between what is political and what is politicized. For example, we can ask the question of which stakeholders benefit when the value neutrality of a particular piece of knowledge is upheld. This is not a trivial question. Consider how it shows up in algorithm-assisted decision-making in the justice system. In some US states, judges use a recidivism risk score to set the bail and jail time. We need to be able to trust the neutrality of such an application of knowledge, and yet we have evidence that the use of this tool in the United States creates a reinforcing feedback loop between escalating jail sentences and recidivism, disproportionately affecting Black men. Perversely, the algorithms powering Facebook and Amazon ads are tested and iterated to a much higher standard than those used in many justice and public education systems because of the profit incentive. Kathy O'Neill writes about this and other examples in an accessible and well-researched 2016 book called The Weapons of Math Destruction. Over time, we have developed imperfect but necessary checks and balances on the prejudice and bias of human decision makers. We should consider what are the new forms of engagement and citizenship that allow for a comparable level of understanding and trust in the machines and algorithms that affect human outcomes. Part of the problem is their inscrutability and non-surveyability by the average citizen because of conceptual or technological barriers. Politics and ideology can also hide behind numbers. Nobel laureates Paul Romer and Paul Krugman have critiqued mathiness in economics. Math was supposed to bring increased rigor and objectivity to the discipline. Instead, Romer describes mathiness in economics as a style of work that, quote, lets academic politics masquerade as science, unquote, by camouflaging political arguments in an ambiguous mix of words and symbols, natural and formal language, and theoretical and empirical content. This has contributed to making the economics discourse, especially of the last 30 years, including its ideological and political assumptions, difficult to access and critique, even by other economists.
Knowledge in politics teaches us that when the politics of something are invisible, we should go looking for them, not assume neutrality. Theories and facts that have been depoliticized can fly under the radar of scrutiny long enough to become normalized as the way things are, which makes them even more difficult to challenge. A good example of this is the politics of natural disasters, specifically the depoliticization of vulnerability to natural disasters. Many of us have grown up with ideas about the inherent vulnerability of underdeveloped countries that fits within a broader problematic narrative of the inherent vulnerability of the so-called third world. Millions of people died in El Niño famines in the 19th century across China, India, and Brazil. Where did this vulnerability come from? An important part of this narrative that frequently fades from view, depending on your context, is the contribution of European empires. El Niño weather patterns were not new to these parts of the world, and local ways of being and knowing had developed to cope with them. Imperialism and colonialism undermined and dismantled these systems with devastating consequences. The historian Mike Davis summarizes very clear comparative histories to support this thesis in his 2001 book, Late Victorian Holocausts. The so-called Third World, he writes, quote, did not enter modern history as the helpless lands of famine, so universally enshrined in the Western imagination, unquote.
This case study is in the sample chapter and is just one example of how the non-European others have long been construed in Western knowledge. The fact of their vulnerability is popularly noticed and commented on. The cause of this vulnerability is not, and has only relatively recently been repoliticized with restitutive and post-colonial histories. If you don't want to get into all of this, it's still worth exploring what's natural about natural disasters, whether we're talking about drought, climate change, or coronavirus. We've included some questions towards this on the next slide. For example, is it possible to make politically neutral scientific claims about the causes and consequences of massive natural disasters? What types of claims about disasters can be free of politics? How do the politics of identity and privilege intersect with the politics of disasters? And how would you describe the politics of the various crises of our time today? That the politics of knowledge underpins unjust or inadequate systems is obvious in hindsight, but this point is of no use to the victims of those politics. The importance of studying this theme is about making political and power dynamics visible in real time, and preparing us to understand, comment, critique, and act on issues before they become impossible to avert.
So we hope that with these ideas, you can invite your students' critical attention whenever claims are made that something is or isn't political. But drawing attention is one thing. What are they supposed to do with these claims, and how are they supposed to analyze and evaluate them? Next, we look at how the idea of knowledge communities can be useful to us in understanding knowledge and politics. Central to this is the realization that we navigate disagreement and consensus, these staples of TOK, not in some abstract space of thought, but in a political space where identity, experience, access, and power make a difference to the outcome. How claims makers gain legitimacy and credibility in the world has a lot to do with their membership and role in various communities. There are two levels of analysis here. The first is within knowledge communities. Whether they're academic disciplines, cultural groups, or online communities, there are shared practices and norms about who can legitimately speak about what and how this agreement is dealt with. The status of expertise and authority are conferred by these communities. Think about how one gets to call themselves an epidemiologist, or economic advisor, art appraiser, or mathematician, and how one becomes qualified to credibly speak on behalf of their discipline. And if we look at the enduring controversies and debates within disciplines, we see that when experts within a discipline disagree, it's not a simple matter of fact and error. Deep disagreements arise from differences of culture, values, and power, concepts that are key to the politics of knowledge.
The second level of analysis is to consider what happens when perspectives from different communities encounter one another in the public sphere. Immediately, what we run up against is that collectively, some communities have more cognitive authority and more legitimacy than others. Consider, for example, how indigenous law has been dismissed by colonial states, or how written accounts by foreign historians frequently and easily supersede oral traditions and folk narratives passed on locally. This is not to say that we should descend into relativism or equate the pursuit and production of knowledge with strategies of power. But there are tensions and dynamics of power, identity, culture, and perspective when knowledges and communities encounter each other. The forces of globalization, colonialism, and capitalism have made a huge diversity of knowledges and peoples visible and available to us. But they have also ensured that these voices, perspectives, claims, and communities do not stand together in knowledge as equals. They don't even stand in the TOK course as equals. And our job is not to make them equal through some pedagogical project. It is to highlight the historical processes through which they have gained and lost legitimacy, credibility, and power to make claims, and the present-day responses to this. This theme invites us to cast a knowledge lens on the big and important questions: what justice looks like, how to educate, and what it means to live sustainably, for example. It asks us to consider who has the final word on these things, and who doesn't even have a voice. This brings us to the issues of epistemic justice.
In TOK, we explore the ideas of legitimacy and validity as ethical issues of knowledge that intersect with power to have significant consequences in the world. This intersection with power can produce two distinct forms of epistemic injustice or violence, which Miranda Fricker describes as the wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. The first form occurs when the credibility of a claims maker is undermined because of prejudice to their identity. Now, to a certain extent, it's intuitive to evaluate a claim based on an evaluation of the claims maker. E.H. Carr famously cautioned his students to, quote, study the historian before you study his facts. But when this evaluation extends to broad categories of identity, this becomes prejudice, plain and simple. What also makes it epistemic injustice is that the harm is done at a societal level when we deny someone's legitimacy based on their identity to make a claim, to be a knower in their own right. We include them, quote, from the very practice of what it is to know, unquote.
Just on this note, in fact, one of the May 2020 prescribed titles was, "Does it matter that your personal circumstances influence how seriously your knowledge is taken?"
And a second form of epistemic injustice arises when a person's knowledge of their lived experience is invalidated because of a lack of shared concepts between them and the dominant culture or power in a society. We see this happening cross-culturally when the dominant culture is the arbiter of what counts as knowledge and who has legitimacy. But we also can see it within a single culture. Miranda Fricker's original example is that of a woman who has difficulty making sense of and articulating her experience of sexual harassment before we had a word for that experience, before a concept existed on which she could attach her experience and make it intelligible to others. Thus, this form of epistemic injustice is also a problem of politics and language.
An old and popular saying, wrongly attributed to Francis Bacon, is that knowledge is power. Importantly, that causality also flows the other way, as power determines what counts as knowledge, even to affirm or deny the lived experiences of others. As you can imagine, this gap affects different social groups very differently, depending on the extent to which they are marginalized. The experiences of marginalized groups is less likely to be understood or conceptualized, less likely to be theorized, explored in cinema or literature or whatever, even by members of these groups themselves. There are exciting new forms of resurgence in response to this, epistemic resurgence, which can be the topic of another video.
But this brings us towards the end of this video. We've covered quite a lot of material. To recap, we've given you 4 reasons why Najin Politics is an important and rewarding theme for your students, and offered some practical suggestions on how to take it beyond cliches while maintaining a focus on knowledge. If you're not going to teach Najin Politics, then at least we hope you've taken away some ideas for how to weave it into the other themes or into your teaching of the AOKs.
As TOK teachers, we send a global cohort of bright young people into the world every year, and we hope that in teaching knowledge and politics, they will be better equipped to change it. It is an exciting and urgent time to be coming together to overcome the divisive issues and wicked problems of the world today.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We wish you the best of luck, strength, health, and happiness as you find a path through these strange times.